And this was one of his notes on Adar, the month in which Purim begins, right? And he writes, it was the policy, the hateful policy of Haman, was to demand a royal decree authorizing to exterminate the Jews. Antiochus, remember Antiochus back in the time of Hanukkah, right? Antiochus sought to attain the same objective with a sword in his right hand and the cunning of seduction in his left, appealing to the senses and befuddling the mind. That which cannot be exterminated physically by murder could well be vanquished morally by diabolical, gentle seduction. A policy that persistently employs both violence and temptation to achieve its ends may be sure of success. This is indeed the policy which has poisoned the air breathed by the unfortunate exiles over hundreds and even thousands of years. Haman's example is followed only from time to time. If someone's patience has worn thin, or if a Haman runs afoul of a Mordechai and seeks to slake his base thirst for revenge, or an even more sordid avarice under the guise of concern for the welfare of his country. Remember, Haman approached Achashverosh and said, there's a people within your empire. They don't worship your gods, they don't keep your holidays, they're lazy, they take one day off every week, right? And he said to them, you know, that if a fly would fall into their wine, they would remove the fly and drink the wine. But if you were even to touch the glass, they would throw it away. Right? What kind of people is that? Right? This was Haman poisoning the air. Right? By and large, the atmosphere in which the history of the exiles unfolds follows the pattern of Antiochus. Antiochus, depending on pronunciation. The unfortunates have been subjected to the pressures and the ridicule of crude force on one hand, and the Satan's smile, the tempting, seductive temptation on the other, in the hope that they will be destroyed physically and morally at the same time. And then the Roman Christian world took a certain book from the hands of the very despised and rejected nation which had been marked for destruction, and hailed this book as a promise of the world's redemption, of their own deliverance from corruption and paganism. The adherents of this creed even began to worship a son of these exiles as their divine savior, and to revere that book and that son as the foundation of all future civilizations and of the advancement of salvation on earth. Then they felt they could no longer dismiss out of hand the suggestion that the origin, the destiny, the history, and the teachings of these scattered exiles had been attended by a special divine element. So now they have a problem, right? Until Christianity, right, they could view the Jewish view as just the enemy, right? But now, once Christianity became the national religion of Rome, state religion of Rome, they couldn't simply say, well, the Jews are an evil people, because everybody understood that all of them were Jews, right? The disciples were Jews, that Jesus was Jews, that they were all Jews, and all of their teachings and all of their ideas of significance, right, were derived from Jewish texts. And you'll see, by the way, when missionaries get involved in trying to convert Jews, they don't bring you any proofs from the New Testament.
No, it's always Morris.
It's always from the Old Testament, from the writings, from the prophets. Is where it always comes from. Right? Because they know that that's actually the only place where the truth lies at the end of the day. Of course, they twist it, take it out of context, right? But they understand that if they went the other way, if they went to, Mark and Luke and etc., that it would just be dismissed out of hand. Right? And he's going to come to the reasons for that in a second. Right? Then they felt they could no longer dismiss out of hand the suggestion that the origin, the destiny, the history, and the teachings of these scattered exiles had been intended by a special divine element. At that point, the urge to destroy the Jews was given an intellectual rationalization. The divine element that had been manifest in these exiles had become a thing of the past. The Jews themselves had cast it aside, and therefore God had scattered them among the nations to break my covenant with them, in quotations. So this is a very interesting idea, right, is that you use military force to destroy the home of a small people, right? And then you say, that was God's will because he forsake them. So consequently, we can do anything we want with them. Right? And in fact, it becomes critical to destroy them in order that you become the new chosen people. Right? At one time,
St. Augustine
yeah,
justified war on that basis.
absolutely.
I just read a paper on that. Destroy the immoral to establish what we consider to be Christian goodness.
That's right. Which is, from his argument, the intention of God. Then the proof of it is that the Jews are wandering, right? That they're miserable wandering people with no land. That's the proof. So we create them as a miserable people wandering, right? And then say, look, they're wandering, so they must be out of favor with God.
Yeah.
At one
That's a self-satisfying argument.
Absolutely. But it's been the basis of terrible, terrible persecution for a very long time. At one time it was claimed that the Jews had indeed been the chosen people, whom God had blessed and found worthy of bringing about the salvation of the world. But now they are the pariahs whom God himself has despised and rejected. He himself has canceled his covenant with them and marked them for destruction. Therefore, those who hate, oppress, and persecute the Jews are performing a sacred task that is pleasing to God. They quote, they that rule over them bring them misery in the name of God. That's from Isaiah. That spirit, which might have salvaged the fate of the Jews and turned the hatred and persecution of the Jews into a religion, thus cutting off even the last hope of the exiles. The biblical promise foresees all of these developments. Right? This was all prophesied, that all these things would happen. Because there's a phrase, this whole piece begins with a phrase which appears both in the Megillah, right? And it's af gamzos, and nevertheless, the phrase nevertheless, right? So it's in Megillah Esther, but it also comes from Vayikra, from Leviticus, right? And the translation of the whole piece is, and nevertheless, even though they are an enemy country, I have not despised them, nor have I rejected them to destroy them utterly, to break my covenant with them. For I, Hashem, remain their God. Right? So it appears in both Megillah Esther, but this is the first place. So he's coming back to that now. The biblical promise foresees all these developments. V'af gamzos. Nevertheless, even though they are an enemy country, I have not despised them, nor have I rejected to destroy them utterly, to break my covenant with them. For I, Hashem, remain their God. As Mishnah explains, I did not despise them in the days of the Chaldeans. I did not reject them in the days of Haman. I did not destroy them utterly in the days of the Syrian Greeks, to break my covenant with them in the days of the Romans. I, Hashem, shall remain their God for that future in which no state, no nation will have power over them any longer. The Yalkut says, even if they have lost their homeland, even if they are strangers in an enemy country, I have not become their enemy. They have not lost me. They still have me. Even if all the shrewdness of the Chaldeans, the trickery of the Greeks, all the power of the Persians, and the secular and clerical prowess of Rome were to join forces to betray this nation as the most despicable, depraved nation on earth, they would not succeed. They will never be able to destroy it, not even spiritually. They will never succeed in erasing Israel's spiritual, God-ordained significance from the minds of men, not even from their own. Now keep in mind when he's writing this, right? Mid-1800s, roughly 75 years before the Holocaust, right? In the midst of the growth of the Reform movement and what looked like the end of Orthodoxy. This is what he's writing. Much against their will, though they may have stormed at Israel over the centuries, they will ultimately have to stand hat in hand, filled with awe and admiration before the historical phenomenon of this nation. Israel's miraculous survival amidst its raging foes, its wonderful resilience, its spiritual and moral vigor in the midst of all its suffering, will force its enemies to concede grudgingly that this is indeed Yad Hashem, the finger of God. God was with the children of Israel and within them, not only in the remote biblical past in Palestine, but He is with them and within them, still even today, amidst the woes inflicted upon them by the European perversity, and He has kept His promise. The words, and nevertheless, in God's promise, and indeed in the reluctant concession by the nations, have transformed the whole history of the Jewish people in Galus, in exile, into a most glorious monument to God. They have set up this nation in dispersion as the great enigma of world history that defies all predictions, demolishes all a priori concepts of history, and mocks the statistical pragmatism of the historians. A nation that compellingly proclaims God, He that called the generations from the beginning, says Isaiah, as the one guide of all human destiny and morality, as the sole invincible, indestructible force in the lives of men and nations. Hirsch's point is that everything could have been predictable, but for Israel to remain a nation, remember this is now 100 years before Israel became a nation again in 1947-48, right? That he's saying that this is a nation scattered all over the world and is still a nation. And this is the veritable proof. And how many times have historians used the phrase a mistake of history? Right? Israel does not follow the course of nations. Nations are small, they rise, they conquer, they become military powers, they become empires, they become desolate, they become corrupt, and then another nation rises and takes it. Right? Pesach is coming. When we hear the stories and the songs at the end of Pesach, they're specifically about this story, about how Egypt and then Greece and then Babylon and then Persia, each one swallowing the other one until Rome. But the one that survived at the end was the kid, a little kid. My father bought the two Zazim. I just want to end this thought with that there was a contemporary who lived not long after Hirsch, who was a very different person than Hirsch. He wasn't Jewish. He was a journalist. And he wrote a piece for Harper's Magazine. And I'll read you what he said.
You said long after or not long after?
He wrote this in 1898. Right? This is after
Harper's
Hirsch
been
passed
around
away.
for a long time.
Harper's been around. It's called Concerning the Jews. Right? And it's written by Mark Twain.
Mark Twain.
Mark Twain.
He was a
Samuel Clemens.
He was actually not. It's an interesting thing. He was not a big fan. He was more of a big fan of the Hebrews than the Jews.
Yeah.
There was a very kind of mixed thing
went
about
to
him.
Israel.
He respected them.
He went to Israel.
He had a respect for them. That's right.
Respect.
Let me read what he says.
He went to Israel. He went there.
That's right.
Yeah, he went
That's
there.
right. He toured Israel. Right?
Toured Israel.
And what he saw was desolation everywhere. He had spent he spent about a year working on this piece, and then he submitted it to Harper's. And this is a little piece of it. If statistics are right, now keep in mind what Hirsch has just said, okay? This is an observation of a non-Jew, very bright person from the Midwest of America. Had, very little contact with Jews in the early part of his life. Later on he was living a metropolitan life.
Yeah.
But he married a young woman from upstate New York.
Later on, I'm saying when he's growing up.
Yeah.
If statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race.
I don't think we do that anymore. We're
Not even
close to
that.
1%.
It suggests a nebulous, dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of. But he is heard of. Has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people. And his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also a way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world, in all the ages, and has done it with his hands tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and be excused for it. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, and then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other people have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now or have vanished. One might think of the great empire of Spain, right?
Portugal,
England, Russia. The Jews saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert, aggressive mind. All things are mortal, but the Jew. All forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? Mark Twain, Harper's Magazine, Concerning the Jews, 1898.
Neat that.
Right. This is, if you look at the continuum, Rav Hirsch was living at a time where it seemed like Judaism was fading. 50 years after this, the Nazis, much more they should be erased, tried to do what Haman did, tried to do. Right. And 60 years after that, Israel is the most feared nation in the Middle East. And still tiny. That hasn't changed. Was it 400 million enemies?
Yeah, all around.
Declared enemies? Right. And we're Goliath and they're David?
Yeah. It's kind of weird, isn't
it? Right. But all of it is true. Right? All of it is true. What Rav Hirsch says is true. What Mark Twain says is true. And the question he asks, right, is one that we settle actually this week. Yithra. Right? Right. This week is the covenant with the nation. This week is when we make the deal. Right? And it's done. Right? When you make a covenant, right, as long as the members of the covenant exist, the deal exists. Rabbi Breitowitz pointed out a number of shears that if you were to buy life insurance, let's say, right? So, you live to 120, right? The people who are the stockholders, when you bought that insurance and you were 20, right, are likely all dead. They're the owners of the company, the stockholders. And they've been replaced by new stockholders. The owners of the company, the managers of the company, the president, the vice president, the directors, the board of directors, they've all passed on. right? And they've been replaced by other people. Now, can they come to you and say, well, you know, Fred Smith, who was the president, died, so we're not going to honor the contract for your insurance? Mm-hmm. The answer is no, right? The entity that exists, right, is beyond an individual, mm-hmm. right? And that's the nature of a bris, right? It is beyond the individual, right? Mm-hmm. So as long as God exists, and as long as the Jewish people exist, mm-hmm. right, this bris has to exist. Mm-hmm. This covenant has to exist, right? It doesn't mean that the Jews don't suffer terribly. It does mean that you cannot extinguish this flame. Mm-hmm. It's not within the power of man to do it. Mm-hmm. Right? You can inhibit it. You can throw carpets over it. Right? It won't go out. It's not a natural flame. A flame needs oxygen. Mm-hmm. This one will continue in the dark without oxygen. Mm-hmm. Right? Because it's not of nature. It is beyond nature. Mm-hmm. And this is why, when historians look at the history of the Jewish people, they're befuddled. Right? You know, the Jews make a joke out of historical theory. Right?
I think there's a deeper meaning in Hirsch. Hirsch is saying that when Jews are persecuted by Christians and by the European civilization, it's a paradox. He's saying they treat Jews nicely, and they're ready to tear Jewish eyes out of their sockets at the same time. And I think he's saying that the Jews proclaim God and Torah, and that goes beyond any paradox. And I was talking to, what's his name, Rabbi Torsinsk from the Kollel?
Turchiner. Mordechai Turchiner. Right?
And he was saying that when the Christian world tries to assimilate and persecute, they always do it with this paradox. They say, here we're going to offer you this if you turn to Christianity or you turn to Neo-Kantian philosophies, but if you don't, we're going to tear the skin off your face. And I'm actually referring to in the Yom Kippur,
the martyrs.
Yeah, with that Roman queen.
Yeah,
or
that's
princess.
exactly what they did. That's what happened to
Rabbi Yochanan. Yeah.
They peeled his skin off.
Yeah.
Just because she found him beautiful, she had to destroy it.
Oh, that's the one who wanted the face of that good-looking.
He's a good-looking man.
She tells the king or the Caesar or whatever to take he wants him to come and he doesn't, and she said and take his face off. Right?
Yeah.
They cut it off.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And the thing is, the Jews, a truth goes beyond the paradox. Truth, real truth, goes way beyond into another reality.
I wouldn't agree with anything that either you or Rabbi Turchiner is saying all this. I would say that one of the remarkable eternal qualities of the Jews, and I think Hirsch is alluding to this, is that there can be the appearance of acceptance. There can be the appearance of destruction. Right? But all of them are really a guise. Right? Why? Because the Jews are not plan A for God. They're not even plan B for God.
It is the plan.
They're the, in a sense, the remaining plan. Right? You know, when God created the world, Adam was supposed to be, the message of God and eternal, right? And he failed, and the generation of the flood failed. Mm-hmm. So, God took corrective measures, right? And started again. Right? And the second time around is failure again, on a massive scale, going to war with God, Tower of Babel. Right? So God found one lone individual who was a very, very stubborn person and a very brilliant person And that person, before God found him, he found God. Long before God spoke with him, he determined what God was and God's existence and how the world operated.
It's interesting.
And God said, for my plan C, right, I'm going with this family. And as you'll see in a second, when we talk about the Parsha a little bit, that God's choice of the children of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov was a calculated choice, and certainly not the easiest sale he could have made. That's very clear. When you think about how the rest of the world, quite comfortably at the time, was willing to make up fantasies about things created from metal and stone. Right? How easily it would have been for God to do a couple of parlor tricks and establish who he was with virtually any nation in the world. Right? He chose the nation that was going to give him the hardest time. Right? In fact, that's who he chose. You know, the phrase stiff-necked is often used, right? And not in a pleasant way.
Question everything.
But one would say, Abraham, I think, was a stiff-necked person. You could call him courageous, right? That's part of being stiff-necked. But I think that one of the things that Rav Hirsch is telling us here is that because they are my instrument, they are eternal. That's really the answer to this question. What is the secret of the immortality? Right? He says that all things are mortal, but the Jew. Right? That means that all things come and go. They live, they die. Right? And he's not just talking about people. He's talking about Kleenex. He's talking about, drinks. He's talking about trees. He's talking about, computers, cars, anything. Right? That's what he's talking about. Right? Everything is, except for one thing, the Jew. Right? And he says, what's the secret of this immortality? Right? And it's clear that there is actually only one other immortal thing in the universe. God. Right? God. Right? God, the Jew, and his Torah are one. Right? And so the Jew, out of a necessity on God's part, continues to exist. Because he has this role to play. Right? So we should be wary of not playing that role. It's a very important thing, because we do have a purpose, and God is long-suffering with us about this. But he's chosen us to be the bearer of his message to the world. Right? And there's a price to pay for that. But the good news of it is that we ain't going away when everybody else does. Right? We're here for keeps.